I'm going to have you advance the slide, Lindsay. Here's what I want you to write down next about Joseph Rediford Walker. He was in Arizona after he was in California. He came to Arizona in the late 1840s, went back to California. Again, this guy was all over the place. And with his acquaintances in the West, he heard that there might be some gold finding potential in Arizona. He came into Arizona in the early 1860s, became very good friends with a guy by the name of Jack Swilling. And Swilling told him that a couple of years before, in the late 1850s, that he and a group of guys had gone after Apache Indians up along the Hassayampa River, because these Apache Indians were robbing stagecoach lines and stealing livestock. And so they went after them, and the Swilling expedition came up the Hassayampa River. We don't know how far up the Hassayampa River they came, but Swilling told Walker that maybe there might be some prospecting potential with that area. And so that's really what led the Walker expedition into this area in the spring of 1863. The Walker expedition is interesting because it really consisted of two groups. There was one group of men led by a guy by the name of Miller, and he had two sons by the name of Sam and Jake. And then the other group of walkers, there were 9 of them, and Joseph Rediford Walker was in that group with 2 of his sons. I mention the Millers because Sam and Jake Miller would stay here in the Prescott area and ranch. Now you know where Miller Valley gets its name. Yeah. Yes, Connor.
How many people were in the Rediford party?
Total 16. 7 in one group and 9 in the other. We know there were 16 of them. Yes?
Me and my grandma, we hiked up to a rock called Indian Rock. Do you know how, like,
I don't. No, I sure don't. Lindsay, I'm going to have you advance the slide. Thank you. Now here's a picture, actual photograph, just a few years before he died. The first time I looked at this picture, I thought to myself, now I'm not sure, now there's a guy I'm not sure I'd want to mess with.
He looks so serious.
He looks like a pretty rough and tough guy to me.
He looks cross-eyed.
And he was. He was a rough and tough guy. And most of the mountain men were. I mean, to go out into the boondocks for 6-7 months at a time, to be able to sustain yourself off the land, you'd have to be a pretty tough person to do that. Okay, Lindsay.
Wait, is he cross-eyed?
Now this is Jack Swilling. Jack Swilling.
Pirate.
We know somewhat about Jack Swilling's life, but in some parts of his life there are gaps we don't know much about. We know this guy was born in South Carolina. We know he grew up on a southern plantation. We know that during the Mexican-American War he fought on the American side. He participated in it. We don't know exactly, he went back to South Carolina after the war, and then we don't know exactly what motivated him to come west. That's just pure speculation on why he came west. He came into this area in 1857, and when I say this area, I'm talking about the New Mexico Territory. He sided himself with the Confederates for about 1860-61, and then when the Union Army came into the New Mexico Territory under the command of General James Carlton, the Union Army captured him, and he ends up being friends with General Carlton, and he ends up being a guide and just doing odd jobs for the United States Army. So I guess, hey, if you get beat by the enemy, you join them, right? And that's basically what Swilling did. Well, Swilling becomes connected with Walker. He becomes connected with Pauline Weaver. And like I said earlier, he told Walker about possible gold discoveries in the Bradshaw Mountains. But Swilling is a very, very interesting guy because he is the guy that starts an irrigation company in the Phoenix area, before Phoenix was ever known as Phoenix. In the 1870s, he begins to divert water from the Salt River to different farms in the Salt River Valley, and he is really the one that started to enable farming to occur in the Phoenix area. He was Phoenix's first postmaster. He was Phoenix's first justice of the peace. And then what's amazing is the guy in 1878 gets accused of robbing a stagecoach. And the verdict is still out whether or not this guy actually robbed a stagecoach. Anyway, he ends up being jailed in the Territorial prison at Yuma. And that's a whole nother history in itself, the Yuma Territorial Prison, which, by the way, you can still tour to this day. And that's where, in the latter part of 1878, Jack Swilling has a heart attack and dies. So he must have been a pretty interesting guy. That's my point.
He only lived 40 years.
Yeah. He wasn't very old, was he? Yes, Tiara.
I was going to ask you something about the picture.
Oh, go back. Yes.
Two things. First thing is, why does his hand look like he has only like 3 fingers?
Well, obviously he's got a hat in one hand, and I think it's actually a gun in the other. A small rifle. I think you can see the barrel of the gun right here. The end of the barrel. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Somebody else had a question here.
I did, but I was going to ask what are in his hands, and you just said
Okay.
your gun and his hat, whatever.
Go ahead and switch. Now, this is a map of Arizona and New Mexico in the 1870s. And I want to explain to you how Fort Whipple got here. Okay? What happened here is that General Carlton and his troops, they congregated in San Diego. And they came up the Gila River here, and they got to right here where Phoenix is. You know, Phoenix is pretty much right where the Salt River runs into the Gila River. And they camped out here, and they heard that there were some Confederate troops down in the Tucson area. So General Carlton sends a scouting party out of about 15 guys. And as they're on their way to Tucson, they get down to this area, right in this area here called Picacho Pass. And in April 1862, a scouting party of Confederates and a scouting party of Union soldiers meet each other, and it's the only Civil War battle to occur in Arizona. And it's not really, it's like a skirmish. 2 Union soldiers were killed, and there were 3 Confederate soldiers wounded, but they survived. Well, obviously, this Confederate scouting party found out that they were greatly outnumbered. There were only about 300 Confederate troops in Tucson. General Carlton had about 1,500 troops, and so as they marched toward Tucson, the Confederates hightailed it out of Tucson, and the Union troops walked in without ever firing a shot. Now, the Union troops would work their way on over into southern New Mexico, and then up the Rio Grande River, and there would be several major battles in New Mexico. One called the Battle of Valverde, north of Las Cruces, in which about 400 men died. And then the Battle of Glorieta Pass, which is about 25 miles southwest of, or southeast of Santa Fe. And that sometimes is referred to as the Gettysburg of the West, because there were about 1,000 troops that lost their life at the Battle of Glorieta Pass. Now, in between the Battle of Val Verde and the Battle of Glorieta Pass, Carlton is camped out in this area here, which is where Albuquerque is today. And Joseph Rediford Walker writes him a letter, and the letter is Walker sends a party over to Albuquerque, and these guys are always writing letters back and forth to each other. And Walker, in his letter, tells Carlton that there's gold discoveries in the central mountains of Arizona. So he sends a party. Carlton sends a party over to the Prescott area, and they find out, hey, it's true, there is gold to be discovered here, and that's what prompted Carlton to think we better create a fort over there in the area to protect the miners. So in November 1863, under the command of a guy by the name of Pishon, P-I-S-H-O-N, Carlton sends General Pishon over, and they decide on creating Fort Whipple out at Del Rio Springs. Now, Del Rio Springs is about halfway between Chino Valley and Palmer. And if you go on Highway 89, there is an Arizona historical marker that tells about Del Rio Springs and how it was really the very first Fort Whipple. Yeah.
So was the Del Rio Elementary named after Del Rio Springs? Or the Del Rio Springs?
Yes, you're exactly right. Exactly right. Now, and they put the fort near a water source. You know, that's where that area is where the Verde River begins. And so then when the territorial officials came out here the next month, in December of 1863, that's where they stayed, was at Fort Whipple. And then in the next few months, the territorial officials decided we need to move the fort closer to the gold fields. And so they decided on a town site, again, next to a water source, Granite Creek, and they decided to move the fort in next to the town. So really, the Fort Whipple only was there for about 7 or 8 months. Because Prescott, the founding of Prescott really occurred on May 30th, 1864. And we're going to talk about that on Monday. Okay? All right, advance the slide if you would. This guy I've been talking a lot about already. General James Carlton. Carlton never was in the Prescott area. But I think he is as responsible as anybody is for why Prescott is here today. And here's why I say that. When the territorial officials came out to New Mexico and Arizona, up in the Santa Fe area, they met up with General Carlton. And General Carlton told them this: don't make the territorial capital at Tucson, because there are too many Southern sympathizers at Tucson. Now, I'm not sure Tucson citizens would like to hear me say this, but in his journal, he says he told the territorial officials, do not make the territorial capital at Tucson because it's a very insignificant village.
Oh gosh. Some people don't know.
In those days, Tucson was probably about 500 residents, and it wasn't very big at all. And so he strongly encouraged the territorial officials to put the territorial capital somewhere in the north away from Tucson. And that's the reason I say this guy's probably as responsible for Prescott being here as anybody, because the territorial officials followed his advice. Okay, go to the next slide. Creation of the Arizona Territory. You've already heard me talk about February 24th, 1863. I just talked about number 2 there. We talked about yesterday why Fort Whipple was named Fort Whipple after Emil Weeks Whipple, the guy that was shot and killed in the battle at Chancellorsville, Virginia, May 1st, 1863. So you know why Fort Whipple is named Fort Whipple. But the territorial officials started coming out here the latter part of August 1863, And you have to understand now, Fort Whipple was only established in November of 1863, and it was only about 5 weeks later after that that this party of territorial officials got to Fort Whipple. So Fort Whipple was brand new when the territorial officials got to Fort Whipple out in what is called Del Rio Springs. We are going to talk a lot on Monday about the territorial officials. We have a number of streets named after them. And on Monday we're going to talk about John Gurley. John Gurley was a congressman from Ohio. 1862 was not a good election year for the Republicans. The war was going bad. If President Lincoln had to be reelected in 1862, most historians would tell you he would not have been reelected. But here's how all this relates to Prescott. John Gurley lost his bid for reelection to Congress in Ohio. The Chief Justice, the new appointed Chief Justice of the territory, was a guy by the name of John Goodwin, who was from Maine. He was also a member of Congress and lost his reelection bid. These guys were Republicans, and they lost to Democrats. Richard McCormick, the first Secretary of the Territory, he was not a member of Congress, but he was running for Congress in 1862 from a congressional district in New York City, actually. And he got beat. So all these guys that got beat ended up being appointed by Lincoln to be the first Arizona territorial officials. I've always wondered, what if those guys had won? Obviously, maybe our history would be quite a bit different because the territorial officials would have been different if these guys had won.